All right, I've been going through my old observers. I didn't become an observer subscriber until the mid '90s, but I did purchase several back issues, and I just recently started reading them again, and I really found this. It's this issue, January 1984, and on the cover it says, now it's a collector's edition. It's covering 1983, right? So it might have came out in, maybe it's from December of '83. So I might change the title. Let me go December '83. It might be that. Okay, so on the cover it says Iron Sheik upsets Backlund, wins WWF belt. So it was probably January '84 because that's the end of December of '83. Hogan Piper signed with the WWF. Awards ratings in this issue. So obviously it is a January '84. So we're going to go to the column Pulling No Punches because I thought this was amazing. Now, I started watching wrestling in 1983, and I always had the impression that nobody knew that the background, like the political things and the background boardroom decisions and all the political machinery of pro wrestling, nobody knew about. I thought, obviously the war that started in January '84 had been brewing for some time, right? But I didn't know there was a community of wrestling fans, hardcore wrestling fans who did subscribe to the Observer and probably some that didn't, that kind of knew that this was coming. So it's amazing to me. And I think Dave Meltzer, who I'm whatever about him. I don't watch modern wrestling. So there's things I like about Meltzer, things I don't care for. But the one thing I will give him, he is very astute in his analysis of the business from a business perspective, very astute. And I thought this column, he hit it out of the park because, and there's going to be other things I read from other observers around this time, 1985. And he calls it like Dave Meltzer. If there's such thing as a wrestling prophet, it was Dave Meltzer, right? Because he called this whole wrestling war and the expansion of the WWF, what it would mean for the business in the future. Meltzer called it right on the spot. Basically, he was going to change pro wrestling and destroy the territorial system forever and consolidate wrestling to a few powerful hands. So let's read. I'm going to read from this. It's called Pulling No Punches. And then he has on the subtitle, No Prisoners. And again, this is January 1984. It looks like right after Backlund loses the title to the Iron Sheik. And Vince signs Hogan, which is the December of '83, and signs Piper, which I believe was January '84. So he's writing this right at the beginning of the wrestling war. He says, the wrestling war has begun. What started out a few years back with many people speculating on what the long-term effect of cable TV has wound up with its most inevitable result. The consolidation of the major pro wrestling promotions into a few select and very powerful hands. So people in the business, and then people probably like Meltzer and other hardcore fans, because back then most fans were not hardcore. Most fans, they'd watch wrestling, they'd go to the matches, probably get some magazines, but they were the after mags that were more of a pulp type of magazine. And Meltzer, even as far back as this in '83, because I have like a very early '83 issue. He's covering pro wrestling, non-kayfabe. Okay, so it's amazing because I didn't think anybody was doing that all the way back then. But apparently, in the 1979 NWA meeting, this is shortly after Georgia Championship Wrestling went on the satellite. Apparently, Mike LaBelle, the promoter of the Los Angeles territory of the NWA, raised concerns about the effect Georgia Championship Wrestling on cable would have on other areas. And apparently also Terry Funk, when he saw that Georgia Championship Wrestling was on cable, decided to sell the Amarillo territory, believed to Blackjack Mulligan and Ric Flair, because he knew the writing was on the wall. And he apparently even said that he foresaw a day when there would be two booking offices, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, where basically it's like what Meltzer's saying here, that the pro wrestling promotions, the consolidation of those promotions would be into a few select and powerful hands. And it did happen like that, except it was north and south rather than east and west. He says, now promotional struggles are nothing new. They've been around as long as there has been pro wrestling, but they have usually been confined to one area. Now the entire nation and perhaps the world has become the battleground as Titan Sports and Vince McMahon Jr. attempt to control the entire business. Now you got to remember, this is very early January 84. He's writing this. This is before Hogan even won the WWF title. This is right after Vince launched his expansion, and the first shot of that expansion, although there had been moves in Ohio became a battleground in 1983 between Georgia Championship Wrestling and the WWF. The first official shot was when he held TV tapings in St. Louis, which was once the capital city of the NWA. So this is right at the beginning, and he's just basically calling it the way it is. If you're watching wrestling at the time and you don't know behind the scenes stuff, I was watching this, I knew nothing of the better. I'm just watching, okay, these are new wrestlers coming in. I just think this is the way wrestling is. It wasn't even until 1985, the week after WrestleMania 1, that I even knew there were other wrestling promotions, right? It's a different world because now you know everything, right? Because everything's at your fingertips with the phones. He says, also in the last month, actions in the last month have made it obvious McMahon Jr. will stop at almost nothing in quest of his ultimate goal, right? I mean, he's seen this all the way in 1983, end of 83, very beginning of 84. Meltzer is seeing that McMahon's going to stop at nothing in his quest of his ultimate goal. And if you're reading the magazines at this time or you're watching, you really don't pick up on this. You do see that there's something different happening. After Hogan wins the title, you see, a slicker looking production, more wrestlers coming in, a deeper roster, right? Piper's Pit. So you do notice a change, but you're not pinpointing that this is basically Vince going full throttle to take over the wrestling world. In the most shocking news in wrestling, perhaps in the last decade, the Iron Sheik won the WWF title from Bob Backlund on 12/26 at Madison Square Garden. I mean, I'd only been a wrestling fan not even a year at this point, but when I found out Backlund lost the title to the Sheik, it surprised me. He says, from all clues, it appears this title change was something of a last-minute and very secretive thing. The dumping from Backlund off McMahon's wrestling throne, in a sense, was McMahon's acknowledgement that his headliner in various promotional struggles was not strong enough to ensure running off opposition, right? Because in 1983, McMahon had just went into Southern California, LA and San Diego, had just went into Northern California, San Jose, right? So he's battling Gagne in Northern California. Southern California, he's trying to establish himself. There's no promotion there at that time. He took over from LaBelle, which was pretty much dead. But he's going into Ohio and battling Ole in the Georgia group, right? And obviously he's planning to go national. So McMahon knows as his flag bearer, Backlund isn't going to cut it. And I love Bob Backlund. That's my favorite WWF champion ever. But the reality is, by 1983, Backlund's run was running out of steam, right? And Backlund, the 80s were a new era, right? 80s were a new era. You had the MTV era. Aesthetics was important. And Backlund I like Backlund's look. He was a big, strong guy, but he had more of that old school babyface 70s look. Very clean cut. Nothing wrong with the clean cut babyface, but everything about him screamed, mid 70s, very early 80s. And we're in the MTV generation. The 80s is a very happening, hip decade. So Backlund knew that to launch his war successfully, he needed a more all-encompassing babyface, someone who could appeal to the mainstream, someone that could be hip and cool. Okay. He says, about 1 week earlier, all of a sudden, Hulk Hogan who in the past year has become the number one box office attraction in the business, backed out of an agreement to remain in the AWA. It was obvious where he was going. So Vern was trying to have an agreement with Hulk to stay in the AWA around this time. And maybe there was a promise for the AWA title. Now, the theory from people is, well, if Vern would have put the title on Hogan, let's say at Super Sunday, that Hogan would have never jumped to the WWF. Totally disagree with that. Why? Because you got to realize, you put yourself in Hogan's shoes. You're a pro wrestler. You've already crossed over into the mainstream with Rocky III. Been on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Been featured in magazine type of, news stories. Why would you be a mark for a prop? Because ultimately, world titles are props. They're important props. They're props nonetheless. Why would you mark out for the AWA world title prop when you can get the WWF world title prop? Not only that, you could get mainstream exposure and transcend the business, because when Hogan talks about his meeting with Vince, when Vince flew into Minneapolis, I believe I don't know if it was November or December of 83, probably November. I think it was around Hogan says that Vince basically laid out his vision to Hogan. So do you expect Hogan being AWA world champion, had Vern put the title on him at Super Sunday, is going to tell Vince, no, I got this AWA world title, man? No. He could have the equal thing of that, the WWF world title, the same prop, but yet all the other stuff on top of that he couldn't get with the AWA. His ceiling was limited with the AWA. The WWF sky's the limit. What would happen had Vern put the title on at Super Sunday and made Hogan his horse to run with, all Hogan would have done was leave the AWA, leave the title vacant. Now, this isn't the 90s, so Hogan wasn't going to go on WWF TV and dump the title and all that stuff. He just would have, I just believe he would have left the title or gave the title back to Vern. It would have really hurt the AWA more than it did with Hogan just leaving without the title because he wasn't champion. That's my take on it. We can't think like wrestling fans. We got to think like businessmen, which Hogan was. Meltzer says, of course, the most recent breakthrough is the WWF heading into St. Louis. WWF tapings from the Chase Hotel will go into Detroit, and the next city on their list, Indianapolis. The WWF in St. Louis? ? Now, by this time, St. Louis was at war, right? Because Larry Madison broke off in early 83 after, was it 83 or 82? He broke off from Geigel, who was running St. Louis at the time, and Vern. Madison broke off and started running opposition at the St. Louis Arena, the Checkerdome. And apparently in the fall, I think September of 83, Geigel stopped doing the actual TV tapings at the TV studio of KPLR. And the St. Louis show just became Central States. That was a big mistake by Geigel. Because from what I understand, ratings went down after that. So it was easy pickings for Vince to come in and say, hey, man, I'm going to give you a slickly produced show, far exceeds what you're seeing with Geigel, Central States. And you're going to have like Hulk Hogan. You're going to have all these big time wrestlers. I mean, it's an easy decision for KPLR. So it's very symbolic of Vince. By this time, St. Louis had lost a lot of prestige. No Sam Muchnick. The power of the NWA by this point was in the Southeast anyways, with Mid-Atlantic and Georgia. So St. Louis lost a lot of its influence, but it was very symbolic in going to the heart of the NWA and taking over their number one, what had been traditionally their number one city in their capital city, St. Louis. Meltzer says that's something a few months ago. That's something, meaning WWF in St. Louis. That's something a few months ago would be unheard of. St. Louis has been the stronghold, really the flagship city of the entire NWA. Now look what Meltzer says about the NWA. Very keen, because we seem to think the NWA started falling apart later on in the 80s when Crockett really started strong-arming the territories in terms of them, when Flair would go into their territory, Crockett demanded that they accept one of his semifinal matches. But he says, what about the NWA? The largest and most powerful governing body in pro wrestling. And he says, we've seen chunks of stone chipped from its side over the past 5 years. So he's going back 5 years, let's say 1978. And he says, we've seen chunks of stone chipped from its side over the past 5 years, but the latest chips seem to puncture the heart. Talking about McMahon going into WWF territory. I mean, going into St. Louis and doing tapings in St. Louis and taking over the KPLR time slot. Now, what chunks is Meltzer talking about in the last 5 years in the NWA? One of the things I think people don't talk a lot about is by the time that Vince starts going national and at the end of 83, beginning of 84, the NWA had already lost a significant amount of power with the decline of Detroit, San Francisco, and LA, and then to a much smaller extent, places like Amarillo, right? Because at one time, the NWA, with the exception of the Northeast and Upper Midwest, they had the whole country, right? You had on the West Coast, San Francisco Shire, LaBelle in LA. You had obviously Pacific Northwest, and you had Detroit in the Midwest with the Sheik. Of course, you have St. Louis, which is a one-city promotion, but Sam, it was the capital. It had prestige. Sam booked the world champion, and then you had, of course, all Texas, the tri-states, and you have Florida, Mid-Atlantic, Georgia. So they had the bulk of the country, parts of Canada, Mexico, affiliates in Japan, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. But at the end of the 70s, a few of these key promotions, LA, San Francisco, Detroit, Amarillo, were on their deathbed. And both Frisco and Detroit pretty much died in 1980. They went out of business. And they were pretty much pathetic by that time anyways. LA was still around, but they were zero factor in the pro wrestling business by late 82 when Vince took over. Those are the chunks Meltzer's talking about. Plus, I believe that when Sam gave up the presidency, I believe 77 or 78, I think you started to see a slide too. Because Sam Munchnick, the one thing he was the peacemaker of the NWA. He was the glue that held the NWA together from an organizational standpoint. And I think once he stopped being president, you started to see the slide. Look what he says here. Now, this is, again, he's writing this January 84, right after the turn of the new year, after the Sheik wins the WWF title. He says, most NWA circuits aren't in good financial shape. So they're already reeling. The NWA is already reeling by the time McMahon even fires a shot. That's what has to be understood. Florida has been crumbling the last few months. They had an awful 1983 from a creative standpoint. And even they were hurting in a lot of ways, attendance-wise, although they would still have good attendance. Meltzer writes about that. The situation in Georgia is obvious to even a casual viewer of the weekly TV show. Georgia was on top of the world in 82. 83, again, horrible booking by Ole Anderson. Just awful booking. The situation in Georgia is obvious even to a casual viewer of the weekly TV show. Alabama, that Southeast, is on its last legs. But ironically, they would last, I think, in 1990. He says, with the exception of Dallas and Mid-Atlantic, what NWA cities can still pack a big arena? So the NWA, even before McMahon goes and invades their territories, is already in dire straits. Especially compared to what they were in the 70s and 60s. And not really since their inception in 48. They grew strong. And, they had their issues, their controversies, FBI investigations for monopoly and all that, but super strong in the 60s and 70s. Anyways, there's still more in this article. I'll do a part 2. But it's really fascinating going into these old observers. And I got to give Meltzer credit. I mean, his analysis of the situation right at the beginning of it and what would be the result of it is 100% spot on. All right, guys, have a good one.